Hello and welcome to the technical integration webinar for SignAS for the fiscalization in Spain. My name is Philipp.
And I am Lukas. Hi.
And we will show you how to integrate our product SignAS into your POS system. The agenda for this webinar will be the following. We will first have a real short introduction. We will give you a technical overview. We'll explain you how the onboarding to our product will be, the setup for the integration, the operation of the product, the compliance aspects, the validation, and the transmission. Let's start with a short introduction into Fiscally and the SignAS product. First of all, our company was founded in 2019. We are a software company building cloud fiscalization solutions, and we are currently already number one in Fiscally with our cloud fiscalization product. We are offering already 6 different API solutions in our portfolio, and we have over 600K point of sales contracts. Our motto or slogan is make receipts simple. So we also have, for example, a product in the digital receipt section, which allows to revolutionize the paper invoice to a paperless receipt and invoice. But coming more to our SignAS product now. So what is SignAS? It's our product for the Spanish fiscalization market. We offer in a single API multiple legislations. By multiple legislation, we are referring to the ticket buy and veri facto legislation. We have a very unique validation system. Since we offer a cloud-based solution, we have automatically updated software, and our test system is free, and we have a very good support for our solution. We are already certified. So our solution is already registered as a certified software in the Spanish tax authorities. And if you want to know more about the Spanish fiscalization, we also have a white paper you can download from our website, which is visualized here. But since this is a technical webinar, let's go into the technical overview, especially of ticket buy and our product SignAS. And maybe, Lukas, how does ticket buy work?
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. So if you're a customer and you're buying something, for example, in a store, then you want to have a receipt, but to get the receipt, there are certain steps necessary. So at first, of course, the POS system registers what you want to buy, of course. And normally, the system also generates an XML file that is then stored, but also transmitted to the endpoint of the different territories, where it is registered and also validated, if everything's okay. And then you get back a response, which then is also processed by the POS. And also there is some compliance information, which is then printed on the receipt and handed out to the customer.
Okay, nice. This is how ticket buy works, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see how our SignAS solution works. At the end, as you already explained, the difference is that SignAS automatically returns the invoice information through the SignAS API. So by using the SignAS solution, we do not have to wait the full cycle until we get back the transmission. And how can we achieve this? By introducing on our server infrastructure through our cloud-based solution a virtual device, which is also representing an invoicing point. So for each taxpayer, as we can see in this diagram, we have a virtual device with dedicated device certificates. We have a client abstraction with the parameters of the point of sales. which also performs the invoicing operation, like signing and the transmission then to the tax authority through the ticket buy API, for example. Since point of sales systems also have to manage different taxpayers depending on the use cases, what do we offer here, Lukas?
Yeah, so for the POS vendor, we have a so-called management interface, which consists basically of a dashboard, which is an UI, and also of an API where you can do all the stuff automatically. And what you can do as a POS vendor is that you can register a main organization. And inside this organization, you can have a lot of managed organizations. So each managed organization should represent a customer of you. And actually, it's also can represent the taxpayer. And a taxpayer then itself can have a lot of signers and also clients in the system. And each signer is able to generate a signature for an XML file, which is then transmitted to the storage and also to the territory endpoint.
And since SignES is abstracting on the level of a taxpayer, the POS vendor needs a little bit more logic to manage the taxpayers. And what do we offer there, Lukas?
Yeah. So first of all, what a POS vendor should do is to create an organization within our dashboard, which is available as an UI, as a browser UI, and also as an API. And what the POS vendor should do there is that he should create for every taxpayer he has a managed organization where he can create an API key. And with that API key, the taxpayer can create a signer. And also for each signer, he can create multiple clients. These clients then can actually use the signer for the signature information for an invoice, and the signed XML file can then be transmitted to the territory endpoints.
Okay, great. So it means for a taxpayer, we have to have at least one signer. And for every POS client, we have to have one client abstraction for the taxpayer.
Exactly.
Great. So let's continue with the actual onboarding of a POS vendor.
Mm-hmm.
So we have now already heard about the abstractions of the dashboard and the management API. Let's have a closer look what the dashboard actually is and how the onboarding through the dashboard would look like. The workflow for this is defined as the POS vendor first has to register or log into the main organization of the dashboard. The URL is listed on the bottom of the slide here. And when the POS vendor is logged in, he has to create, besides the main organization, a managed organization, which represents one taxpayer. So if a POS vendor supports multiple taxpayers, then multiple managed organizations have to be created. And like you already mentioned before, Lukas, the POS vendor also has then to create an API key for this managed organization. And maybe let's have a quick demo on how this looks like.
Mm-hmm. So I'll open the dashboard here. And this is the dashboard of Fiscally for all the signing solutions. I'm already logged in with my account.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an organization. So it's an organization for a vendor, for example. And well, the first step here is that you need to create a managed organization. So you would go under settings and organization management. Here I already have 3 managed organizations, but for the purpose of this webinar, we create a new one.
Mm-hmm.
Let's create one here. So first we would need to select a country for the organization. Let's select Spain. Then we would give it a name, call it test webinar here. And we want this to be a managed organization for a taxpayer. Here we can also see the organization that's managing this managed organization. We also need to give an address. And then we're basically done. So this is just if the billing address is different, but here it should be the same. So, and after this, we can select our managed organization here. And then you can see here on the left point that we are inside our managed organization. And to actually use this managed organization in our API, we would need to create an access token. This we can here for Spanish SignES product, go under dashboard and create an API key.
Mm-hmm.
And here what is really important, you can see the API key and the API secret. And the API secret is only shown here once as soon as the API key is created. So we will copy it here and use it later in our API requests.
Okay, nice. So this is the whole onboarding for a dashboard, right?
Yeah, this is the first step for the dashboard, and now we have a managed organization.
Great. So when we go back, so like we already said, it was the onboarding for the dashboard. But I remember you mentioned before there was also the possibility to use a management API. So the management API is actually the API which lies under the dashboard, which performs all the same operations you just showed through the graphical user interface in the dashboard. But also maybe let's make a quick demo on how to programmatically create a managed organization and an API key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, of course, if you have a lot of clients, a lot of taxpayers to manage, you won't want to do this on the UI, of course. And so we have there also an API for that too. And the steps are basically the same. So we want to retrieve first an access token so that we have access to our API. And then we want to create a managed organization, and then we want to create an API key like we just did in the interface. So let's log in. After we log in, we get an access token. That's a GBT token that we will use in the subsequent requests. We can, for example, list our organizations here, and then we get a nice list of the organizations we just saw in the UI. We can create the managed organization here. That's important is that we set this field here that the managed organization is managed by our main organization.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really important here again is that we have here the information about our organization. So, and what we can do afterwards is create an API key for our organization here that we just created. And again, here we get the key and also the secret that we then can use in the SignES API.
Great. Okay.
So back to Philipp.
Yes. Then, so we have now both onboarding steps through the dashboard and through the management API. We have our API key, so it means we actually can use now the SignES product, so through our SignES API. Let's continue with the overview of SignES in the sense of what are the actual resources, how is the setup to set up the product, and the daily operation. Let's talk first about the resources. So we already mentioned some aspects of our solution of SignES. We have client abstraction, so we have a client resource in the API. We have signing devices we call signer resources, and of course there's the main resource, the invoice itself, and the taxpayer. All of these 4 resources are represented in our SignES API. And let's start with the actual setup of those. To set up the SignES API, we need first to retrieve an API token, a JVT token, which can be done through the API key we just created, through either the dashboard or the management API. Then we can set up the taxpayer information. We would need a tax number and the territory the taxpayer is operating through a create taxpayer API operation. Then we would need to create a signer resource with a managed device certificate through the create signer API operation. And last but not least, we will need to create a client, which actually represents the POS client from the POS vendor through a create client operation. And Lukas, let's see how this is done.
Okay, let's see this in action actually.
Mhm.
Okay, so like Philipp just said, we first need to authenticate, of course, with our service, and that's the same with the management API. We have this key and the secret that we created before, and we can log in, which will respond with a JVT token that we will use with all the further requests. The next thing would be to create a taxpayer. So when we've downloaded the Postman collection from our developer page, we have nice filled out examples here. And for example, we have here a taxpayer with a tax number, with a legal name, and also the territory it operates in. And also we can see here a nice feature. It's called metadata. We can store this information with all the resources we have in our database. But let's focus on creating a taxpayer first. And as we do that, we get a nice response back. So that is actually the data now that is stored in our system. After we created a taxpayer, of course, every taxpayer needs a signer with a certificate. So we create the signer here first. Basically, this needs no information because it uses the certificate, our managed certificate. So we just create it here. We could also just remove this metadata here and send an empty request and store it without any metadata. And here we get all the necessary information back, like the certificate, and also, very important, the serial number and the state that the signer is at the moment enabled.
Yeah, this serial number here is very important, right? Because the taxpayer has to register this serial number at the tax authority he is operating. Because this we use, of course, in our XML creation. So,
yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the next and final step for this would be to create an actual client that can create invoices here. And again, we don't need really any information because the client will just get assigned a random signer from his taxpayer. Mm-hmm. And so now we have a client here, and we also see the signer that got assigned, because we have only one signer, it is the signer we created just before, and also the state that it's currently enabled.
Okay.
So this was basically the setup.
So we have a taxpayer resource, we have a client resource which is enabled now, and we have a signer resource which is enabled.
Yeah.
So what would happen now, let's say in the setup process, you would detect that the taxpayer information is not correct. Could you just update it?
No, it's not so easily, because actually if the taxpayer has still a signer or a client that is enabled, he could issue invoices But for example, if he wants to change its territory, then it first has to disable all the clients and also the signers, and then he can change his information and has to create new signers and new clients so that the signing chain starts anew.
So maybe a recommendation would be to set up the taxpayer, check the information if everything is correct, and then continue setting up the signers and clients necessary for the implementation.
Yeah, and for the checks, you can of course use the response you get from the set taxpayer endpoint, or also retrieve it afterwards, where you get all the information that is stored.
Exactly, perfect. Okay, then this was already the complete setup. Let's come back to the presentation, because the next step is actually then we can start creating invoices, right? Which would mean we come to the actual SignES API daily operation. So therefore, we have a dedicated create invoice API operation. And interesting here is that we support different kind of invoicing types in SignES. We support the simplified invoice. We support a complete invoice, which also includes recipient information. And we support the correction of simplified and complete invoices. And even for the correction, there are two different cases. Like you can create a correction by differences, where you just provide delta updates to an invoice, or you can make a complete substitution of line items of the whole invoice, so to say. And yeah, I think better it's to show it, Lukas, right? So I'll switch back to you. So let's make a simplified invoice as an example.
Simplified is always good. Okay, so we've created a taxpayer, we created a signer, we created a client, and the client wants to issue invoices. So we have a really easy abstraction here of all the stuff that later goes into the XML file. We have a type that's simplified. We need a number, of course, for the invoice. We need this description. We need the full amount of the invoice. And we also need the line items. So, and this is basically it. And here's also the metadata. So let's try what happens if we send this. Then we get back a lot of information, also with the compliance. What's really important here, which we can see later, but the compliance information is the TPY code, the URL for the validation, and also the QR code.
Okay. So when we send this simplified invoice request to SignES, it creates an invoice resource, right? And even this resource has a state, because the state of this invoice is issued.
Here we can see the state. In our system, it is issued, and we can also see the transmission state we will cover later.
Yeah. Maybe we open quickly the developer page, so to also explain a bit more about the different invoices types.
Okay, so let's show you the developer page. So here we get actually a lot of information about the stuff from our API. You can find links and also the quick start. Here we can see again the dashboard and also how it's like to operate the Postman collection. But let's jump to the invoices where we were actually. So here you have the content where you can actually change, for example, the type for simplified, for complete, for correcting invoices, and also add a lot of other stuff like series or a specific transaction date, but these are optional.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lukas. Then let's go back to the operation. So we're covered now the basic daily operation case to create invoices of different types. Let's continue with a more unusual type of operation, but it also happens. It's the cancellation of an invoice functionality. This is only necessary when an invoice was created on our system but the invoice was never handed to the customer. So there is a functionality in the legislation which allows to cancel invoices, and this is possible in SignAS by using the update invoice API operation. Besides this, there's another operation which can be used to inspect the invoice transmissions, so the actual data which is sent from SignAS and to the tax authority, by using the exporting functionality of an invoice. And the communication from SignAS to the tax authority is called registration and cancellation request response XMLs. And Lukas will show us now the details about this.
Okay. Let's first do cancellation. So we have issued this invoice before, and if we want to retrieve the invoice, so let's say we want to get its current state, then we can see here that the state is issued and it was registered by the authorities. So, and now we want to cancel that invoice. That's basically really easy. We just state here that the state should be canceled now. So when we set this to canceled, and what this changes is that the state is now canceled in our system, and the transmission state is pending. And if you retrieve the invoice after a few seconds again, then the state here of the transmission is that it's also canceled. This means that it was canceled by the authorities.
Is it possible from a canceled invoice resource to go back to issue?
No, actually not, because if it's canceled, you can't alter it anymore. You're even not allowed to. So it's not possible to go to another state from canceled.
Right. What if I want to inspect now all this information from the transmission?
So there's a dedicated endpoint where you can retrieve all the XML information. That means registration, request, and response. And also, if a cancellation happened, also the cancellation, registration, a request, and a response. So if we inspect this here, we get the cancellation request that we sent to the authorities. We get the response back. And we have also the registration request from earlier and also the response.
Perfect. Great. I think we can continue, right? Because now the basic SignAS API operation, workflow, and processes. Let's talk a bit about the SignAS API compliance aspects and the validations. So first, let's talk about compliance. In order to be compliant as a POS vendor, there needs to be information printed on the invoice. And we provide all the necessary information to be compliant in our signed invoice schema from the API, which all invoice resources return. And we even named specifically a field containing the compliance information, compliance. And this compliance field consists of the ticket bytecode, the validation URL, and the QR code, which actually encodes the validation URL. Besides this compliance aspect, there is also the in-person verification information about the software which produces the invoices, which we also abstracted through a nice software resource through a retrieve software or API operation. Both of these aspects, Lukas will show us now how this is retrieved.
Okay, so first of all, if we issue an invoice or retrieve it afterwards, we get the compliance information here under this tag. So we get the compliance code, we get the QR code, and we also get the TBITE code and the URL of which should be printed, so the QR code and the TBITE code at least, to the receipt. Like I said, we can also retrieve it afterwards. If you want to retrieve the invoice again, then we have all this information readily available. And for the software information, there is a dedicated endpoint for that. So we can just say retrieve the software information here, where we get also the license code and the solution and the version which was used here.
Great. Then let's go to the next aspect. It's the validations. So all of our invoice resources provide also in the signed invoice schema dedicated field called validations. And in this validations field, we provide an early status information of checks the SignES solution performs before even the invoice gets transmitted to the tax authority to provide a form of sanity checks. Furthermore, this validations property in the signed invoice response also will contain all the validations provided from the tax authority servers or service when this information is retrieved on the SignES side. And the validations or validation codes we even define in a predefined set of validations. Maybe Lukas can give us here also an example.
Okay, so let's say we have an invoice and everything was correct, like with our first invoice. Then we have this nice object here that's called validation. So here everything went well, and also if we retrieve the invoice from the authorities, the validations stay empty, so that means everything was okay. But let's say we did some miscalculation here, or we gave a wrong quantity here, and we sent this to our endpoint. Then you should get here in the validations field a nice code. Here we have a code that the item VAT calculation was incorrect, and that was because we issued a wrong quantity. So you get some early information feedback that there was something wrong with the request, but nevertheless, it is sent to the authorities. And if this goes through, we actually should see some information here from the authorities. You can see it here. There are several validations actually failing. And this means that there was something wrong with the invoice.
Great. So all magic happens in the SignES response schema. Great. Let's go back. Because there's another aspect which is really important for SignES. We heard it now multiple times. It's about the transmission aspect. Since SignES takes the invoice creation requests, creates the ticket by XMLs, and sends them to the authority, there's a transmission happening, a communication cycle. And this actually has two different ways of communication. So there's the registration communication happening. And if there is a case of cancellation, then of course there's also the cancellation communication with the tax authorities. And for both of these communication cycles, we provide in the signed invoice response a field called transmission, which represents the dedicated communication states for both of these communication cycles to always inspect in which kind of state the communication is currently at. But this is better explained in a live example. Back to you, Lukas.
Okay. So let's say we want to issue a simplified invoice again, and everything is okay. And we issue that, then we have here the transmission state that the registration is pending, so it was not yet registered with the authorities. The cancellation is, of course, it is not canceled because we did not cancel it yet. And inside our system, the state is just issued so that the invoice was issued in our system.
So it would mean now, if you would retrieve the resource again from this invoice, what would happen? What would happen then?
Well, basically, it should be registered now. So let's check this. Yeah. So the registration went through. Everything was okay. So it is registered now with the authorities. And what would happen now if we cancel that invoice? So we cancel it, and then the state in our system goes to cancelled. The cancellation in the transmission is pending, so it was sent to the authorities, or it's awaiting the sending to the authorities, and it's in pending. And if we retrieve the invoice again that was cancelled, then it's now cancelled because it was actually cancelled by the authorities.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this is for a case where everything is well, right? The invoice is now properly created. You talked before, also showed us a nice example about the validations. So what would happen now if we would have an incorrect invoice created?
Yeah, so change the quantity again, which we know is obviously wrong. And if we send an invoice with the wrong quantity, we of course get the validation here from our system, but the registration is still pending because we don't know anything from the authorities yet. But when we retrieve the invoice again here, we see that it requires correction. So this means basically there was something wrong with the invoice. It was registered by them, but there seems to be something wrong and it should be corrected.
Okay, great. So all of these states, if the registration was correct, or it's registered with problems, in this case requires correction, or even the case if the transaction was happening, but the tax authority couldn't process it, we offer another state called requires inspection. So all of these transmission cases are handled by SignES and reflected in this signed invoice response. Okay, great. That's it. This was the last aspect of the integration of SignES. So we thank you for being here. And if you need further information, so just write us an email to the support email listed here. Or also, if you want to check out the developer page Lukas showed before, it contains a lot of information necessary to integrate SignES and which payloads you need to send, which requests you will receive, and so on. So that's it. Thank you.
Bye. Have a nice day.